All right, everybody. I am Don Costa, host of the Flip Talk podcast. I'm here today with a really cool guest, Joe McCall. Joe, how you doing, buddy?
Don, awesome. Glad to be here, man. Really am.
Glad to have you on, man. So, we're going to talk today. We're going to get into virtual wholesaling and the creative stuff that you talk about. I think it's going to be a really, really cool conversation. Before we jump into that, I want to let everybody know that subscribing to this show is going to help me get the word out about what we're doing. So make sure you're subscribing to whatever platform you're on. If you're watching here online, like I mentioned a few times, I'm broadcasting everywhere that I can possibly broadcast at once. But eventually it's all going to be on the Flip Talk podcast page with Don Costa, and that'll be the only place I broadcast these. So if you're looking to catch these live, make sure you're going there and liking that page so you get notified when we go live. And if you're interested in being part of what we're doing, our community at the Inner Circle Elite Mastermind, go to beinthisroom.com and make sure that you check that out as well. And then that's enough of the business. I'm not going to let Joe stand here and listen to me ramble on. Joe, let's get into, I mean, I'm sure everybody out there knows who you are because you've been around for a while and you've been doing some really great things. But in case they don't, tell me a little about who you are and what it is you do.
Cool. Well, first of all, let me say I love that domain, be in this room. That is cool.
I sit and think about these things at 2 a.m.
If you ever want to get rid of that domain, let me know. Let me know. My game was just going, so I brought it down. All right. So anyway, good. Thanks, Don. I'm glad to be here, man. I don't know if everybody knows me, but if they do, that's awesome. I've been doing real estate investing full time since 2009. And I started I was a professional student for like 2 or 3 years. And I was just buying course after course after course, and I was one of those guys. I'm an engineer by trade, by background, and I had to have all the answers figured out. I had to have steps 1 through 8 all figured out. I had to have it all in a blueprint, exactly how a deal would go from beginning to end. And I was getting real frustrated because I could never do a deal because I had to have all my questions answered, all my I's dotted, all my T's crossed, and so I realized later, looking back, like no deal is ever the same. Like it's not like you can follow an exact blueprint to do this, then do this. If this happens, then do this, because every single deal is different. Every house is different. Every seller is different.
Right.
So I don't know. I just struggled with that because in engineering, you have blueprints, you have drawings, you have a complicated math formula, and there's one answer, and there's one way to get to that answer. So. Finally, though, when my back was against the wall, I said, I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to stop changing things. I'm going to stop asking questions. I'm just going to do what this guy says to do. And then I started doing deals and I started wholesaling. Then eventually I got into lease options, and that was what allowed me to quit my job and start doing real estate full time.
Yeah, that's cool. I want to kind of emphasize something you said about the difference in every single deal. That's one of the things we struggle with internally in training our team on the pivot points, right? When you're doing acquisitions, there's these pivot points, and you can't give somebody an if this then that for every scenario. It's got to be something that you learn through experience.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that is take action. As a coach, you can give somebody, so much information, but the experience that ties into that is what they have to get by taking action. And so the analysis paralysis, you're talking about beating it to death and setting that aside and listening to what your coach told you and taking action. I just want to encourage people to do as much as possible, because you never know the pivot points and how things apply until you get out in the real world scenarios.
Yeah. And you only learn by making mistakes.
100%.
That's what everybody's so afraid of. And I get it.
Right.
But here's the cool thing about real estate, especially when you're doing wholesaling or lease options. If you make a mistake, you can fix it. If you make a bad offer, well, you can fix the offer. You can go back to the seller, renegotiate, maybe even cancel the contract if you have to. When we're wholesaling or doing lease options, we don't put a ton of money down up front. You put maybe $100, maybe $1,000. I don't know. It just depends, but like worst case, you lose your earnest money deposit or your option deposit, right? So that's the good thing about what we're doing when we're flipping paper. Now, I would be more concerned about making a mistake if you're doing rehabbing, right? Because then you got to be, you don't have to start there. Don't start doing rehabbing. Start with like wholesaling or lease options. And as you learn how to analyze a deal and you learn how to make an offer and how to negotiate with sellers and how to sell your deals, you become better at it. And that's just the plain fact of the matter. That's the best way to learn.
100% agree. 100%. So you got into the lease option arena. That's your expertise now in virtual wholesaling, right? That's a lot of what we're gonna get into today. So let's talk about some of that. Like, what are some of the cool things about lease option? What are some of the things people need to know? I don't even know what the questions ask because it's not my
Yeah.
arena. So educate me.
Well, I'll tell you how I got into it, because like I got tired of throwing away leads. I was spending a lot of money on direct mail, and I was throwing away. I was doing deals, right? But I was throwing away a lot of these leads that didn't have any equity.
Mm.
And I've always been a fan of lease options. When my first investment property was a complete disaster. It was a house we lived in. My company transferred me. We rented our house out, and it was just a disaster because the tenant was always late. I was struggling to pay the rent, and every single week they called me with something I had to fix. I thought a property manager would help, but they didn't. They made it worse, and then they were taking tons of fees on everything. So I said, I'm never going to own another rental property again, ever. But somebody recommended a book to me called The Secrets of a Millionaire Landlord by Robert Sheeman. And one of the chapters in there was about lease options. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I realized with lease options now, you can rent a property instead to somebody who wants to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
I call them penalty box buyers. They can't get a mortgage right now, but they want to. They just need 6 to 12 months, maybe 1 or 2 years. And so they're going to treat your property better because they're trying to buy it. And they put a larger down payment, and they're responsible for the day-to-day regular maintenance and repairs and stuff like that. So I really became interested in lease options and started studying a lot, made a lot of mistakes. But then somebody said, I think it was Nelson Rockefeller said the secret to success, or the secret to wealth, is to own nothing and control everything.
Right.
And so when it comes to real estate, you can control property. You get the same benefits of owning property without owning it, by controlling it. So you can control a piece of property through a lease option. A lease option is where you lease a property for a period of time with the option to buy it in the future. And during that lease option period, right, nobody else can buy the house. Like only you can. So the seller is obligated. They have to sell it to you. You just have the option. You have the option to buy it. And so you can do that over a period of time. So I started doing a lot of wholesaling and marketing, and I was throwing away a lot of leads that didn't have any equity, or they weren't super motivated. And I was getting frustrated with the competition. Everybody's chasing these same seller leads. And I thought, there's got to be something I can do with these leads. Like, for example, house is worth $150,000 in the Midwest. Okay. Let's say it's in California. The house is worth $400,000.
Right.
And the seller owes, let's say, $380,000. There's just not enough equity in there to do anything with it, right? And so I started thinking, well, what if I got that property under a lease option contract? What if I said to the seller, listen, the most I could pay for cash and buy it now would maybe be like $300,000. So it's worth $400,000. I can pay $300,000. But I say, listen, what if I could get you the $380,000 that you need? You wouldn't be interested in maybe leasing it for a year or two and then selling it to me, would you? So I started asking questions like, could you lease it to me for a little while and then I'll buy it? And started getting more and more sellers that said, yes. So I thought, wow, this is cool. But, there wasn't maybe enough equity for me to stay in the middle of that deal either. So I thought, in wholesaling, you wholesale a deal to an investor or a cash buyer, right? So I thought, why can't I wholesale a lease option to a tenant buyer instead? So I can get this property with a little to no equity under a lease option contract, and then sell or assign that contract to a tenant buyer who will take my place, and I can get out of the deal and I can make money on that assignment. So I started doing what I call wholesaling lease options. I didn't invent it. Other people call it like lease option assignments or cooperative lease options. So it's just finding a seller that's willing to rent their property for a period of time and then sell it to you. And then taking that contract and either staying in the middle, that's called a sandwich lease option, or assigning or selling your contract to another tenant buyer who's going to take your place and getting out of the deal. So I started doing that in 2009 and started making more money doing that part-time than I was in my full-time job. So I started doing more lease option deals. I found they were easier to negotiate over the phone. So I didn't have to try to beat them down in price to 60, 70 cents on the dollar. And I didn't have to go see the houses. So it was easier to do these deals over the phone. And the other thing was like, I'm not very good at negotiating, right? I didn't like trying to beat sellers down to 60 cents on the dollar, but I can give them whatever price they're asking for as a lease option. So that became a lot easier. The final thing I'll say to this, what made me so attracted to it was I was spending thousands of dollars a month on marketing. I stopped doing all my direct mail, and I only started going after landlords and for sale by owners that were already advertising their houses on Craigslist and Zillow. At the time, we didn't have Facebook Marketplace, but I started then contacting landlords and for sale by owners on Craigslist and Zillow and saying, hey, I saw your property. You wouldn't be interested in maybe selling it. I saw your rental property. You wouldn't be interested in selling it, would you? Because now, if they're willing to rent it and they're willing to sell it, they might consider a lease option. So I started doing some creative marketing like texting and voicemails and emails. And then I figured out, wait, I could get a VA to do all that marketing for me. And then I only talk to people who raise their hands. So I went from spending thousands a month in direct mail to only spending a few $100s and getting more deals than I could handle just from Craigslist and Zillow, contacting landlords, contacting rentals on Zillow. And I also started doing a lot of deals from follow-up. So the more you do this, the more the momentum builds. And so I've been doing that ever since.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, we're in, my market's obviously cycle, and we're in a more competitive market cycle now than we probably have been in the decade, right? And so being able to be creative with your leads and monetize, that's one of the reasons why I went from just rehabbing to wholesaling was I was throwing leads away. And so now we're rehabbing and wholesaling, we're still throwing some leads away. Now we're looking at, getting creative in that side of the business as well, and monetizing with lease options and sub two and owner finance and all kinds of other stuff. So I have Matt Smith basically chimed in here, and he said, so in a lease option, is the money spent kind of like paying rent until you take the option to buy? So
yeah, pretty much. You're paying rent to the seller. Now in my case, I make sure the rent goes to the mortgage company, right? Like I want to make sure that mortgage is being paid every month. So I'm going to use a third-party escrow company to pay rent to the seller, but it's going actually to the bank. Well, let me rephrase that. I'm using a third-party escrow company to collect the rent from the tenant buyer that's living in the home. And then that escrow company, that third-party payment processing company, they pay the mortgage, and anything that's left over, any difference either goes to me or goes to the seller. So you got to make sure that you're paying that rent. So it's kind of like owner financing, but you're not taking over the deed. It's like subject to or land contract, but you're not taking over the deed. It's just a lease with an option to buy it in the future. And, I've done a lot of subject twos and a lot of owner financing. I prefer lease options because I think, in my opinion, they're less risky. If the deal goes bad, it's easier for me to get out of. And I'm not taking over the deed. So if I had to get out of the deal, it would be easier to get out of the deal. And I'm not raising any red flags with the mortgage due on sale police. When you take over a property subject to. Now there's a place for subject twos. I don't want to get into that. But like I just found with lease options, it's easier to negotiate with the seller. It's easier to tell them and convince them of what you're doing. And they don't have to be as motivated as a seller who's going to give you their property at 60 cents on the dollar or deed the property over to you and keep the mortgage in their name. So they don't have to be as motivated. And there's a lot more of those sellers. Make sense?
It does. So let me ask you a few questions here. So one is, we talked about little to no equity situation. Would you ever lease option a house that's upside down?
Yes, on a longer term. Okay. So I can give sellers any price they want as long as they're willing to wait for it.
Okay.
So if a property is upside down, maybe I won't lease option it for 3 years. I might do 10 years. I might tell the seller, listen, I'll give you, I'll buy the house from you for whatever the loan balance is sometime between now and in 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. So it just depends on the term. It also depends on the cash flow. So if I'm going to stay in the middle, it has to have cash flow and equity, a little bit of equity. So general rule of thumb, it's got to have at least 20 to 25% of the rent for cash flow that I can keep, and 10 to 15% back end equity that I can keep for myself. If it doesn't, then I'm going to assign my contract and get out. But let's say a house, it's worth 300, they owe 320, which by the way, Don, I just saw this. CoreLogic does this report every quarter on kind of the housing market. And if I could find it, I'll send it to you. But did you know there's certain states right now in this market where 10 to 20% of the homes are either low to negative equity or under negative equity? Does that make sense?
Right.
And Illinois is one of those states where you're seeing 15 to 20%, depending on where in the state it is, where the properties are underwater. So we're getting back to those days where you're seeing more properties with little to no equity to negative equity. And if the seller gets a job transfer, if they have to move or there's a divorce or something happened and they're like, I don't know what to do. Like, I got to sell this property, but I can't afford to pay the commissions. So they just rent it out, but they don't want to be the long distance landlord, or they tried renting it out and they're frustrated just like I was when I had a rental, and they're tired of dealing with tenants. And there's nobody helping them. There's nobody saying, listen, maybe there's another option. I can give you, Mr. Seller, the same equity you'd get if you sold it with a realtor. I could give you the same cash flow you'd get if you used a property manager, if you let me do a lease option on the property, and you can structure it. And that's, again, another reason why I love lease options. I can negotiate like 3 or 4 different things. I can negotiate my option price, the rent, the term, 1 year to 5 years to 10 years, the down payment, and maybe even rent credits, so I can say, I can get you seller that price you want if you give me the rent that I want, or I can give you the rent that you want if you give me more time or give me the price that I want. So you can negotiate all of these different things when you're dealing with the sellers.
So Matt chimed in again here. So if they get foreclosed on, you're not in a second lien position. You basically have no control of the property. So what are some of the
seller wouldn't get foreclosed on because I'm making the mortgage payments.
Right. Okay. So that answers that question. What about like any kind of liens or anything that come up, like the seller gets an IRS lien or a judgment against them? Like, is there ways to protect yourself against that? Or is that part of the risk factor in doing it?
Yes and no. It's part of the risk factor, right? That can happen in anything. The seller could die. Right. The house could fall into a sinkhole, right? Like, there's so many things that could happen. There's things you can do to protect yourself. Number one is I always file a memorandum of option to cloud the title, right? Okay. Number two, I like to sign, if you got to get a local attorney to help you with this, a limited power of attorney. All right. That limited power of attorney, if that seller dies or in 3 years they decide, I don't want to sell this house anymore, you can force them to sell it through that limited power of attorney. Okay. By the way, you're going to have those same problems, right, whether you take the house over subject to or do a lease option. If the seller goes into bankruptcy, if they have an IRS lien or judgment, the bankruptcy courts, the IRS, they don't care who's on title, right? They don't care that it's in a trust. Do you think they care? No. They're going to attach that lien to that property, which has to be taken care of if it goes through bankruptcy or whatever. So just because you're doing a lease option or you're doing a subject to or owner financing or land contract or whatever, doesn't mean that you're protected from things that may happen in the future. But there's things you can take along the way to protect yourself. Number one, make sure you're paying the mortgage payments. Number two, record a memorandum of option, cloud the title. Number three, do a power of attorney. Number four, you can even sign a purchase and sale agreement in advance. That this is our purchase and sale agreement that we're going to execute in 3 years or 4 years. The other thing, number four, and this is so important, people forget this. During those years that you're lease optioning the property, you need to stay in communication with the seller, right? Send them a Christmas card, call them once in a while and just give them an update on how things are going. Stay in communication with them so they're not like, in 3 years, I wonder what's going on with that property,
Right. Yeah, that's all wonderful advice. And I do want to point out that what you said about bankruptcy, because I've actually had that happen to me in a situation. There is, whether you buy the property cash at a discount or you do a sub to, or you do some kind of creative option, if they go into bankruptcy, there's fraudulent transfer and they can actually claw back that transaction up to 4 years if the creditors really want to get nasty about it. So, and if they feel like you bought the house at a discount because the seller was trying to hide assets, right? They can actually try to claw that back. I've been through it. It's happened. And so you're right. It doesn't matter what strategy you use, those ramifications are
and that freaks a lot of people out because they're like, oh man, that something bad can happen. But that is rare, number one. But when it does, all right, I that's why I like lease options, because I just had an option. I didn't take over the deed, right? So nobody can claim mortgage fraud or whatever. And then also, like, the tenant buyer that I put into that house, they paid me 5-10 grand to get in that house, right?
Right.
They may not be able to buy it. So, okay, I've got to give them back their 5 to 10 grand. Not a big deal, really. In the big scheme of things, if I'm doing one of these a month and I'm making, 10, 20 grand a month on these deals, I may have to give the seller, the tenant buyer, back some of their money. But here's the thing to remember. I always teach this and I do this when a tenant buyer puts their money down, I save at least half of it into an emergency unknown account, reserves. Because if something happens and I have to refund that tenant buyer the money, I have it. I don't have to scramble for the money, right? The other thing I'll say is, well, I forget, but it'll come back to me.
Well, let me hit on that for a minute, because there a lot of people, when I've heard lease options through growing up in real estate investing in the almost 20 years I've been doing it, people, the way I understand it is, when you get that deposit, that down payment, you keep that. If they default or move out and they don't complete the option, you keep that. You're saying that you don't always keep that. Explain that to me, because that's a twist. That means you're trying to do things. I think not ethical is probably not the right word to use, but you're trying to go above and beyond. It sounds like
that money that the tenant buyer puts up front, you don't have to keep that in an escrow account or set aside in a separate savings account. It's not like an earnest, or it's not like a security deposit. Mm-hmm. Where a lot of localities have requirements with security deposit that has to be in a separate account or whatnot. It's an option deposit that can go into Hip Pocket National Bank. But what I'm saying, if you want to be smart, you should save at least half of that money. Even if you have just regular rental properties, like, you should always be saving aside money for unforeseen circumstances, for emergencies. Something is going to happen, and the more deals you do, something is going to happen. And you don't want to be caught with your shorts at your ankles when you're like, a deal goes bad. Because if you do enough deals, you're going to have a deal that goes bad. We've all done it.
Right.
You haven't had a deal that's gone bad yet. Well, you've not done enough deals. So you need to have a rainy day fund. You need to have something set aside to cover expenses. Like, let's say, for example, here's an example. The furnace goes out on the property. And the way I set up my lease options is I tell the seller, I'm going to be responsible for all of the maintenance and repairs under $500 or under $1,000 per occurrence. Okay. And then I pass that same responsibility on to the tenant buyer. I'm going to say, listen, tenant buyer, you're responsible for all of the regular day-to-day maintenance and repairs under $500 per occurrence, or under $1,000, right? So then I might go get a extended home warranty to cover the major appliances, or I might go make the seller might get an extended home warranty or something like that, right? Well, let's say the furnace goes out and it's a $3,000 repair, and the extended home warranty doesn't cover it because, for whatever reason, they find a way to wiggle out of it. The air filters were not changed regularly enough, right? Mm-hmm. So now that tenant buyer, the furnace goes out, it's 10 degrees outside, and they don't have heat. And the seller is refusing to fix it. All right. So in my contract with the seller, I have in there that says, all right, if I have to fix something that you can't fix, I'm going to get a credit of that times 2. So if it costs me $3,000 and I have to go in and fix that furnace, then I get a credit from the seller of $6,000 if and when I buy the house in 3 years or whatever. So you're going to have the money to fix that furnace, because if that tenant buyer is standing before a judge, the judge is going to say, no, you're the landlord. You can't pass on those responsibilities for repairs to the tenant, right? So you need to have an emergency fund set aside for, a couple, $3,000, $4,000 for every deal that you're doing. So in case something happens where you have to fix it up. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. The other awesome thing about lease options is I'm not putting any of my own money in to fix the house up. So I can go to a seller that needs 20 grand in work. The house needs 20 grand in work. I can negotiate a price from them. And then, like, normally what I like to do is I like to make an offer at 85% of the as-is value. So the house is worth 200,000 fixed up, but it needs 20,000 in work. So it's worth today 180 as is. And so I'll make an offer of 180 times 0.85. I'll make an offer for 155 or whatever. That's So I have 15%. So then what I do is I turn around and I advertise the property for, if it's worth 180 fixed up, I'll advertise it for 190. Okay, as is to a tenant buyer, handyman special. So the tenant buyer can go in there and fix up, and you'll be shocked how many times, I mean, like my properties that I advertise as a lease option as a handyman special, if I can discount it, like give them an extra 5-10% equity, knock a couple $100 off what the market rents would be, if they go in and fix the house up themselves. Every time I've done that, I've been shocked, blown away by how many people apply. Like I've done this with properties that needed a full gut rehab or just needed paint and carpet, but I never do any of the own work. I never do any of the rehab work to get it ready. I can get the tenant buyers in there to do the work, and they want to. They get to pick the flooring themselves. They get to pick the cabinets themselves, And if that tenant buyer doesn't buy the home, then I actually get the property back in a better condition than it was.
Right.
And that's the other thing I tell the seller. Listen, if I don't buy this property in 3 or 4 or 5 years, you're actually going to get it back in better condition than it was before. And we're going to be paying you the rent that, guaranteed on the first of the month every month that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise without any of the management and landlord headaches. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, it's really, really cool. So that's the advantage of lease option that I understood it was you got a buyer tenant who's going to take some ownership into the property and make it their own, which is huge instead of having to go in and rehab them yourself. So very cool. So what are there states that people should get some advice before they lease option? If they hear this and they don't want to reach out to Joe, which they should reach out to Joe and get information before they do it, but they decide they're going to get crazy and go out there and just start lease option. Are there states where they should probably reach out to you first or do a little research before they get anything going?
All 50.
Okay.
Yeah. Like you should always, no matter what kind of deals you do, you should always get a local attorney to review the contracts and say, hey, listen, what's the best way to do this? My students do this all the time is they take my contracts and give it to a local investor-friendly realtor, attorney, an investor-friendly attorney, and says, hey, will you review these contracts and let me know if can I do lease options here? First of all, let me rewind. I had a student in Atlanta, Adrian. He wanted to do lease options in Atlanta. He just went to Google, did a search for real estate attorney, and gets on the phone and calls every single real estate attorney he can find until he finds one that says, yeah, I can help you with your lease option deals. No problem. I know exactly what a lease option is, et cetera. Adrian sends her my contracts. The attorney reviews them and she says, they're fine. Just add these few little things here. And get this is so cool. The attorney for, a fee of a few $100 is willing to help him close these deals. And so I'm not sure what the attorney charges. But she's willing to, now you can tell the tenant buyers and the sellers, hey, listen, my attorney will send you the paperwork. You can schedule a time to go visit my attorney. Have the tenant buyer make the check out to the attorney. And the attorney turns around and makes you a check after the tenant moves in. Because then, that tenant buyer, when they're getting the loan in 2 or 3 years, can show the bank a check made out to an escrow company or to an attorney, not to Joe Blow, the investor. And it makes it easier for them to get the down payment money. So it gives you more credibility. So every state that you're in, you should find an investor-friendly attorney that can help you with your lease option deals. And don't just ask them, hey, will you give me the contracts, right? Give them some lease option contracts to review and say, hey, will you review these? The other thing I'll say there's free resources out there. I think Rocket Lawyer is one of them, and Law Depot is another one, .com, where you can buy real cheap state-specific leases and option agreements, all right? And so you can take these agreements and have an attorney review them. The other thing I'll say is this, and I've done this before when I'm going into other states. I'll find a realtor's contract, and a lot of times realtors have leases, and they'll also have option agreements. And I'll just plagiarize, copy, I don't know what you want to call it, steal. I'll steal the realtor's contracts and I'll take out all of the broker language, right? And I'll use that as my own lease. And sometimes I've done this before too. I'll find a good property management company that has a ton of properties that they manage in a certain city. And I'll ask the property management company, I'll pretend to be a tenant interested in one of their properties. And I ask them to give me one of their leases so I can review it. And so I'll take the lease that the property management company, who, and these realtors, these property management companies, they've hired tons of lawyers that understand the local laws there in that city, and they understand the requirements for all of that stuff. It's already in the contract, so you know you're good.
Right.
So, having said that, like, you want to find an investor-friendly attorney that can help you with these, and they are out there. And if you get an attorney that says you can't do lease options, they're illegal, then find another attorney. You're going to find attorneys that will tell you it's illegal to wholesale. It's illegal to do owner financing. No seller would ever sell you their property at 60 cents on the dollar.
Right.
It must be illegal if that's what, so find another attorney, because they are out there and they will help you. Right. So.
Well, let me chime in on that, because I've learned the hard way that not all attorneys are created equal. And it's just like not all doctors are created equal. You don't go to a dentist to do something for your heart, right? You go to, a cardiologist. You don't go to a foot surgeon if you need brain surgery. You go to somebody who specializes in whatever that it is that they're going to do for you. And it's the same thing with attorneys. A family law attorney is the worst attorney to give you advice when it comes to real estate transactions, and so on and so forth. You need to find somebody that specializes in that arena in your area. And the other thing with that is you don't want to pay an attorney to learn. It's been very expensive for me to do that, where their expertise isn't the field I'm asking them to do something for me in, and I'm paying them the time it takes them to do the research when I could have went to an expert. So definitely find somebody who specializes in real estate law.
Very good.
You start having those conversations with.
By the way, where do you find them? Well, you can go to your local real estate clubs, start asking around to other investors and wholesalers in your market, ask around to realtors. And then worst case, just go to Google and start calling them. They're out there.
Yeah. So 100% agree.
Oh, let me say one more thing too with Texas. Texas is unique. You cannot do sandwich lease options in Texas, but you can do lease option assignments in Texas. And I've read the law in Texas. Nowhere does it say you can't do lease options. It just says that if you do a lease option, you have to follow these certain rules. And when it comes to a sandwich lease option where you're staying in the middle, it's better just to do a land contract or a contract for deed or subject to or something like that, right? So it's just different paperwork. But I have friends that have been doing lease option assignments for 15 plus years in Texas, doing them just fine. So every state has their own unique thing. North Carolina or South Carolina, one of those two, has some special language in the contract in the law that says what you have to include in the lease option paperwork. And it's not a big deal. It's stuff that I do anyway. Like number one, you have to record the option with the county. Number two, you have to make sure the loan is current. And there has to be, like, the house has to have landlord insurance, like landlord policy or something like that. Stuff that we do anyway. And there has to be full disclosure. We do that anyway.
We should be disclosing. So yeah.
Oh, yeah, we always do. Yeah.
Yeah. I think like anything else, as long as you're approaching the transactions where you're not trying to take advantage of anybody, right? Like you're not trying to be predatory and either side. And
can I touch on that?
Yeah.
That's so important, because people get in trouble with lease options. Lease options have gotten a bad rap for two or three really big reasons. Number one, investors are doing them on crappy properties. Like, you should only do lease options on homes. Like, if you're in the Midwest, homes over $100,000, maybe over $125,000. Like, I see too many investors doing lease options to get around the Dodd-Frank rules, where they're trying to do lease options on crappy, junky properties. That's a mistake. I don't like doing lease options even on mobile homes either. Like, you could do owner financing with those, right? But with lease options, you should stay in the median home price range. You get better quality tenants. You get people that are more likely to buy the house. That's number one. People don't, they do lease options in bad neighborhoods and bad, cheap homes. You don't want to do that. Number two is they put people in the house that just, if they can fog a mirror and have enough down payment money, they can get in the house. That's a big, big mistake. I've heard gurus teach, like, I don't care if they ever buy the house. If they have got enough money, I'm going to put them in the house. And in fact, I hope they don't buy the house because then I can get somebody else in there and get more option deposit money. That's bad. I'm strong with this. Like you should only put people in your houses as a lease option tenant buyer who have a realistic chance of getting a mortgage in 1 to 2 years. So you should be working closely with a mortgage broker. If they have, a $50,000 unpaid child support or whatever, then you shouldn't put them in that house. They don't have a realistic chance of buying that house in 1 or 2 years. So you got to make sure they can afford it. You got to make sure they have a good debt to income. You're not putting them into a house that even after they got their credit fixed, they don't have enough income to actually get a mortgage and buy it. So I only want to put tenant buyers in my nicer homes that have a realistic chance of getting a mortgage in 1 or 2 years, that a mortgage broker has reviewed and said, yeah, you know what? I can't promise or guarantee anything, but if they do this and this and this based on the requirements today, they should be able to get a mortgage in 1 or 2 years, So you want to make sure then that, you get tenant buyers that put at least, 3 to 5% down, that you're setting them up to win. So I'm always wanting to set up win-win and win with 3 wins scenarios. The tenant buyer has to win, the seller's got to win, and I got to win. Those are good deals. That's doing the right thing.
No, I agree 100%. And honestly, where people find themselves in hot water usually is when somebody complains, right? And generally, people only complain when you give them a good reason to. And as long as you're doing your best to make sure you treat people right and you come from a position of service and you're doing things in the right manner, you're going to be successful generally for the long
exactly.
term. So let's switch gears to virtual wholesaling, because I know it's a topic I threw in the title. I want to make sure we cover that before we run out of time here. And so let's talk more about that, because you're known as doing a lot of virtual wholesaling. And I know we talked when I was on your show a week ago that your virtual wholesaling land in my backyard. But so let's talk about that a little bit.
I love virtual wholesaling because that's how I got started with it. I was like, I didn't have the time to go see the houses and meet them in person. So I had to get creative. I had to learn how to close deals over the phone. And I found actually it was easier and I could do more deals. And so I've been virtually wholesaling for a long time. We do lease options. We do wholesaling like cash deals, and we also do vacant land. And I just love doing deals. But back 2012, 2013, I started seeing a lot of money coming back into the market, a lot of cash coming back into the market, out-of-state landlords wanting to buy properties. And I had done deals virtually before, but I thought the way to grow my business was to hire a bunch of acquisition managers. And so I hired my first acquisitions manager. I got an office, I had an assistant, and I was an official professional wholesaler now. But I find myself like I was working way too hard. I was still putting out a lot of fires. I was still being way too involved. I wanted to go travel around the country in our RV with my family and our 4 kids. I wanted to go to Europe for 3 months because we homeschool our kids. I wanted to go travel around the world. And so I was frustrated because I was still working hard, but I was only netting at the end of the day, looking at my numbers, I was still only netting 40% of the deal after marketing and all that stuff. So I thought there's got to be a better way. So I heard this from a friend. I listed all of the steps involved in a deal. And I asked myself a real simple question. How can I do none of this? I started thinking that my eyes started opening up to all the possibilities. How can I get someone else to do all of this for me? How can I do none of this? So I thought, all right, well, the marketing, I can get a virtual assistant to do that, or I can get a mail company to do that. The pre-screening the leads, I can get a virtual assistant with really good English to pre-screen the leads for me. And then instead of hiring an acquisitions manager, I started partnering with local wholesalers. And so I started finding local wholesalers that were already doing deals, but they didn't have a huge marketing machine behind them. All they were good at is just driving around the country, driving around in their truck, looking at houses, talking to sellers, and negotiating deals. That's what they were good at. They already had the buyers. They already had the title companies to use. They already had the contracts. They already had access to the money if they needed transactional money or hard money. They already were good at talking to sellers. What they weren't good at was handling the administrative stuff of the marketing and handling the leads and pre-screening the leads and all that. So I started finding local wholesalers and I said, listen, what if I did the marketing, I provide the systems and the VAs, and I give you pre-screened motivated seller leads? Will you take them and work them and close the deals? And we'll split the deal 50-50. And so I started finding wholesalers that started doing that for me. And pretty soon I wasn't doing anything. So I went from doing, I was probably working 30, 40 hours a week, which was frustrating to me, doing just deals, putting out fires, going to the title company, getting money, whatever, making still 40, 50% of the deal, to partnering with local wholesalers and making maybe 35, 40% of the deal, but working zero. I had someone else doing everything for me. And then I started growing and expanding. I was doing this at the time in about 5 different markets: Tampa, St. Pete, Memphis, Florida, Las Vegas, St. Louis, and there's one other city I'm forgetting. This is fantastic. So then later on, I wanted to start doing land investing. And so I bought a course on land investing. I found another friend who was not, they didn't want to do houses anymore. So I just said, hey, listen, what if I did the marketing, brought in the leads, you work the leads, and we'll split the deal. And with them, I'm doing 45-55 split. And yeah, so I've now, the deals that I'm doing now, I'm not involved in it at all. I know you aren't either, but I'm even less involved because I'm just here in my house. All of my team is virtual in the Philippines, or they're local boots on the ground in different markets. We're doing a lot of cold calling now, and we're doing a lot of direct mail for land, vacant land, and I just have the systems in place where other people do all the work for me. Now, I could probably make more money if I, was either going on the appointments myself, or I had an in-house team and I managed that, but for me, I'm more of a lifestyle guy. I'm not good at managing large teams and systems like that. I'd rather, only work a few hours a day. So I'm okay with not making millions and millions of dollars a year in my wholesaling business. I have more things that I'm passionate about that I want to do, like my podcast and teaching and stuff like that. So it's different for everybody. But the important thing I want to make in all this, my main point is this: list all of the stuff that you have to do a deal, and just ask yourself a question like, how can I do none of this? How can I get someone else to do all of this for me? And then you start thinking bigger, better questions. And you start seeing possibilities and doors that you didn't see or know were there before. Make sense?
Yeah, it does. No, it makes perfect sense. And that's, when somebody asks how to hire, if you have an organization, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, what do you hate and what do you suck at, and make a list of all the activities and figure out what you hate and suck at. And that's the first person you hire. Right. And
yeah.
And you kind of go down that line, you try to offload everything. So I agree 100%. Great advice. I've had you for about an hour here, so I don't want to keep you any longer. Great information so far today. Any advice you give somebody just starting out? What would you share for somebody was just getting into the game right now?
Well, get educated. Like, there's a lot of good podcasts. There's a lot of good books. I'll give you my book here in a minute.
Well, your podcast is a great podcast too. I want to point that out.
Yeah. Well, how about this? This is a book I give away for free, but you have to pay for shipping and handling.
Right.
And I didn't ask you this in advance. I hope it's okay.
It's okay.
If I will email you the PDF of this book for free if you subscribe to my podcast. So if you want the physical book, go to WLObook.com. It's called Wholesaling Lease Options. Discover one of the fastest and easiest ways to make money in real estate today. And it's all killer, no filler. This is a thin book, but I like go into a lot of detail how to do these types of deals. And I will send you, so if you go to WLObook.com, it's free, but you got to pay like $7 or $8 in shipping and handling. If you subscribe to my podcast and send me an email to support@joemccall.com, support@joemccall.com, and you show me that you've subscribed to the podcast, I'll email you back a PDF of the book, and you don't even have to pay for the shipping and handling. And my podcast, by the way, it's Real Estate Investing Mastery. Real Estate Investing Mastery. So subscribe to it in iTunes or Google Play or whatever you listen to, Stitcher, and or not Stitcher, Spotify. Subscribe to it and just send me proof to support@joemccall.com that you subscribe to the podcast, and I'll email you back a PDF of the book. So in the email itself, because I'm not going to get the email, my team's going to get it. Just tell them that I said this in the email and show them the proof, and then they'll reply back to you with the PDF.
Perfect. That's awesome. What'd you say? No filler. What was that? All killer, no filler. I'm gonna have to steal that. It's a cool term. Yeah. So Okay, so check out Joe's podcast, subscribe to the show, get a free copy of the book. That's actually a very generous offer for you to get a copy of that book. So make sure you're doing that and see what Joe's got going on. He's putting on a lot of good content. I was on there about a week ago, so it's definitely something I recommend you do. Joe, tell everybody how to get a hold of you besides that. Can they find you anywhere? I'm sure all over Facebook and everywhere, right?
Well, joemccall.com, but my podcast is maybe the best way, realestateinvestingmastery.com.
Okay.
Don't message me on Facebook. I get too many, so I ignore those. But yeah, so joemccall.com or my podcast.
Okay, perfect. All right, man. Well, I appreciate having you on today.
Thanks,
If you are getting value from the show, make sure you're subscribing to this show as well and sharing it with people. In fact, I'm going to start doing some giveaways. I've been giving away Flip Talk shirts. If you if you share this with somebody and you let me know that you shared it, do the same thing, snapshot it, send me an email. I will send you a link to get a free t-shirt, a free Flip Talk t-shirt, and maybe send you some other goodies as well, because I want to get the word out as well. Make sure you're checking out beinthisroom.com for what we have going on with the Inner Circle Elite. And the last request I have, if you got value from the show, I'm wanting to build my Instagram up. So at The Real Don Costa, make sure that you are going and you are following me on Instagram as well. So Joe, I appreciate having you on, and thank you very much for the information.
I appreciate you and your show, Don. You're doing good things. Keep it up.
Thank you.